This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
There's perhaps nothing more enduring than the sounds of blackness and the images of blackness. Today, we're joined by two scholars, Professor Nicole Fleetwood of Rutgers University, talking about her new book about black visual culture, Troubling Vision, and we're also joined by William Banfield, musician, ethnomusicologist, theorist, historian, also an author of a brand new book on black musical culture. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black. Welcome back to Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, your host. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Nicole Fleetwood, who is a professor of American Studies at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and she's the author of the new book, Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, just published this summer by the University of Chicago Press. How are you doing today, Nicole?
I'm well. How are you, man?
I'm doing fine. And let me just start by saying just how beautiful the book is, both in terms of the quality of the cover and paper, but just some of the, the way that the cover is laid out. It's a striking book. So yeah, I imagine there are a bunch of folks that would pick it up, obviously because of the content and obviously because they know Nicole Fleetwood is brilliant, but at the same time, just because, the cover art is striking. Could you talk about the photo that's on the cover? Before you say.
Yeah, sure. The image the photograph is taken by Lyle Ashton Harris. And has Lyle been on your show?
He has not. He has not. I'm very familiar with his work, though.
Yeah, and so Lyle is a really important photographer,
right.
Contemporary African-American photographer who also really does a lot of interesting work around gender and sexuality. And much of his early work is what I call performance photography, where he, as photographer, is also the subject of his photographs, and many of them are him dressing in drag or playing with what we, kind of feminine aesthetics. And he has some work also that he's done collaboratively with his family. His brother, Thomas Allen Harris, is a well-known filmmaker who's doing a really interesting project right now, also on black photography with Deb Willis. And a friend of mine who's an art historian also actually found that image for me.
Okay.
For the book. And I was very familiar with Lyle's work, but it was more his own, his body of work where he is the subject of his own eye. And so this image really struck me. And I think it plays quite literally with the title, Troubling Vision. Yeah. And I also like just the contrast of, the bright red dress on the woman's body. And the image itself is playing with the history of still life. And that the image is called, an Italian word for still life. The title for the image is. And so he's playing with that notion of still life, and also the history of using the black nude and black bodies in Western art.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Nicole Fleetwood, author of the new book, Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness. You begin the book, Nicole, talking about this experience that you have in high school. It's 1989, and you go with a group of your friends to see Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, and how that moment becomes kind of marked in your own experience about how groups of folks can go see the same thing and come away with two very different kinds of images. And this becomes kind of a marker of that reality for you as you go forward in doing the kind of work that you do.
I thought you were going to say I started the book with the story of my grandmother.
Right.
When you said you start, because for me, the entry point is through my grandmother.
Right.
And so I just wanted to mention that.
You mentioned that scene with your grandmother in the grocery store and Shauna, and introducing her to your white friend, and how your grandmother was a little, you couldn't quite read what her reaction was to that.
Right.
Why don't you talk about that a little bit? Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't I'm not trying to hijack.
No,
you.
that's okay. It's okay.
But when you said start, for me, that's like the entry point. And one, it's like any time, any opportunity I have to reference my grandmother, I will, because I just
that.
totally adore her. And she passed in 2008. But I've been reading a lot of poetry and thinking about poetic experience, and really trying to think about how we can trouble theory, and by bringing personal experience and poetic language into it. And I'm not saying I'm a poet at all, but I do feel like poetry and personal experience allude to something that theory cannot. And I think it's hubris for academics to think that we can answer all questions through like academic discourse. Right. So I've been trying to, in my own writing and thinking and meditating, trying to figure out the place of poetry and personal experience and kind of my academic journey, as a scholar. And I didn't know how I wanted to start the book, and my edits were due. And I woke up one morning just thinking about my grandmother, and just, in that, like having the experience of seeing her being seen in a way that traumatized her. And it just, it did something to my body responded to it. And so I just started writing about that, not knowing if it would go into the book or if it would go somewhere else. And I'm glad I started the book with that, because I really do think when I'm reading your work, I'm reading, some of my other colleagues or friends' work, I always think about their body and who they are. Often like when we're reading this kind of academic, language, where it seems so detached from the person. And so I'm always thinking about who is that person and the conditions under which they produce their work, and what might be happening in their lives, because for me, I that does bleed into it, and I think it bleeds into everybody's work. But like I want to, that awareness of it changes my reading experience. And not that we need to know everybody's biography, but I do like to think about the fact that there's a living, breathing body producing that, and that person has a whole set of experiences that's informing the way that they're writing and thinking through things. And so I wanted that. My body and my experience and my history to inform my reader that therefore, I'm seeing race and visuality very much through the kind of adolescent eyes, these kind of adolescent eyes of seeing my grandmother marked in a certain type of way. And I think that continues to shape me. And it's a haunt, and I think we all have these haunts, these moments of marking, right, that we of interpolation that just they don't go away. They just we continue to gain insight and see them differently as we grow and as we acquire new information and new experiences, but they're there as a haunt, right? And I think so, and it's a troubling for me, and that's kind of the troubling presence of race. That I wanted to just allude to something beyond theory.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, your host. We're joined by Professor Nicole Fleetwood of Rutgers University, author of the new book, Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, University of Chicago Press. One of the things that comes out, in the book, and you have this, theory of how you view Black public culture and notions of iconic status. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I'd love to talk about that, because I've been thinking a lot about iconicity, not so much as just an image, but as something that produces responses. And so, like, especially in terms of thinking about Black public culture, and I use that term loosely because for me, the idea of Black public culture is not something that's static or fixed. It's something that actually gets produced at particular moments as responses to things. I think the icon is one way in which Black public culture gets reproduced.
Right.
And so I'm interested in how, we come to know Blacks as a we through our responses to iconic images.
Figures,
and then I use the theory of Harriman and Lucchese talking about the iconic affect, about how iconic images or icons produce an effective response in the public. So I think about Michael Jackson as one example of that, or Rosa Parks as another example, the kind of image of Rosa Parks on the bus, as these kind of iconic images or icons, as celebrity icons, functioning differently than obviously a photograph, in the way that we come to define ourselves as Black people through our responses to these images or people. And and part of it is a critique. Like I think I think the response to the icon is something important. It's a gathering site. It's coming together and having this feeling of Blackness, like this kind of, or what Kaisha Silverman talks about, this kind of oceanic feeling of like humanness, or like the shared subjectivity. And I think that is useful and necessary, like to feel a part of a collective. But I also think that, it in itself can be quite troubling in terms of like this fixation on the exceptional, the icon as something as an exceptional person or an exceptional moment. I also think that there's this desire to have the icon resolve the kind of history of racial violence and all the trauma, of Blackness as lived experience and as discourse. Then the icon, we kind of fixate on this icon as somehow having this power to resolve that which I think is irresolvable.
You do a lot of work around the work of Charles Teeny Harris, who was affectionately known as One Shot. And of course, he took these tremendous pictures of everyday working class Black folks in Pittsburgh, and in some ways is making a claim on the importance of the everyday, in opposition to our desire to always kind of put forth this image of the iconic in this context. Can you talk a little bit about Harris's work?
I would love to. Charles Teeny Harris was a photographer born and raised and lived most of his life in the Hill District of Pittsburgh, and Hill District throughout much of the 20th century was a Black working and middle class neighborhood. After the civil rights era and after a period of urban renewal, the city rezoned the area and pretty much wiped out the kind of Black business sector that really made that district thrive. So the district now is, I think, in kind of in the 21st century, there's all these projects attempting to kind of repopulate the area, but it experienced a lot of blight in the kind of post-60s moment. But Harris, throughout much of the early and mid 20th century, took pictures of Black everyday experience in that district. And when he died in the late 90s, he had amassed over 80,000 negatives, and most of them were taken of people in that district. It was his archive is considered the largest collection of images of Blacks in a singular community in the world. And when he died, he had tried to work with a local entrepreneur to help him market and sell some of his work, because he had worked for the Pittsburgh Courier, which is a Black newspaper, and at one period it was the largest circulating of all the Black newspapers, right. and didn't have a pension. He had made a choice to work exclusively with the Pittsburgh Courier, even though he had been recruited by some larger mainstream newspapers. And so he died without a pension. He died quite impoverished and without control of his archive, because the entrepreneur basically ran off with his images. And after he died, a federal judge settled the case and gave the archive back to his children. his children then sold it to the Carnegie Museum of Art. And the Carnegie Museum of Art has been doing really interesting projects around his archive. Part of what they're doing is trying to identify a lot of the subjects, the historical subjects, the people in his images. He was known to not label most of his images. And so you have this really large archive of, of Blacks from the community who have not been labeled or identified. And so they're working with the contemporary Pittsburgh, a lot of the Black community, to label and identify a lot of these images. And what you find is that, grandchildren are identifying their grandparents, and cousins are identifying, other cousins. And, so it becomes part of this this community practice of archiving, which I think is really quite fascinating. Given also the kind of critique of the archive historically as, excluding especially underrepresented populations, marginalized groups, working class folks, and obviously people of color. So to see that this community itself is working with an institution like the Carnegie Museum to identify and archive and to, kind of signify what's important in these images, to me is really fascinating. It's an ongoing project. I've been fortunate enough to work with the museum a bit, and when I was working on the book, I went and met with the photo archivist, and I'm going to be doing a talk actually to the Pittsburgh community about Harris's work in January, and the kind of ongoing projects that they have around his archive and the kind of the relevance of his work to 21st century Pittsburgh, where a lot of the buildings that are in his images no longer exist. So it becomes his images now are taking on even more relevance and resonance in terms of looking at the contemporary landscape of Black Pittsburgh and that which was documented in many of his images.
Cultural memory, yeah. You're watching Left of Black. We're joined by author and professor Nicole Fleetwood, professor of American Studies at Rutgers University, the author of the new University of Chicago Press book, Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness. We talked a little bit about, Teenie Harris's photos and the kind of, realist aesthetic that's there in some cases. A few years ago when President Obama, then President-elect Obama, chose Elizabeth Alexander to perform the inaugural poem, and she did a wonderful interview, profile of her in the New York Times. And she talked about this ongoing pressure in talking about Black art, that, so much of what folks think of as Black art is the sociological content. She was making an argument for form, that there is a Black form that rarely gets talked about. And some of that, I think, bleeds into some of the subjects that you look at in the book. The idea that the realist view of Black life continues to be really overdetermined in what we think of as Black art.
I actually think that I know a lot of critics and artists have talked about, this kind of exhaustion with realist aesthetics, but I think that there's a reason why people in general like to see images that, quote, look like themselves, and I think that even as we talk about the kind of limitations in realism to get at Blackness, that folks respond to realist aesthetics, and for me, therefore there's a reason to study that, right? And so I tend to be interested in what people consider what gets denigrated a bit, or what is considered obvious or passé. That interests me because, I want to know why people are dismissing those categories as such. So I'm really interested in how people use realist aesthetics, and especially Black folks in their kind of everyday lives, how they incorporate realist aesthetics into their own vernacular photography, their attempts at home videos, their any kind of productive play that people engage in their everyday life. And I do think that there are people who are using realism and realist aesthetics in really experimental ways. And so I don't think experimentation and realism are opposites at all.
They're not antithetical at all, right? Yeah.
One really brilliant example of that to me is a contemporary filmmaker and professor at University of Virginia, Kevin Everson, who works with the documentary form. Like many people read, he's an experimental filmmaker, and his films do not conform to traditional narrative whatsoever, but they, quote, look like documentary. And he says, when he talks about his work, that he uses realism as his tool, and he uses the real or everyday as a tool to explore form. Yeah. So, for example, he has a film called The Pritchard, where it's shot on 16mm film, and there's a young black man who's pushing a car for the entire length of the film magazine, which I think is about 10 minutes. And that's all you see is this black man pushing a car for 10 minutes. And we can read all kind of narrative into it about, this broke down black working class guy. There's all this kind of familiar language that we might bring to the image, but he's not providing that narrative. And so I think part of what he's doing is making the audience think about what kind of narrative we bring to these kind of images, to images of blackness, especially, quote, realist images of blackness. I mean, we already have this narrative that we're imposing on the image itself. So for me, I think there's a lot more space to actually kind of explore what's happening within realism. And part of it, why I want to do that is because folks respond to it. People, and by folks, I mean everyday black people who are outside of the academic, arena. Right. Want a picture that looks like them, and I want to know, why do they want a picture that they don't want a picture that looks like necessarily some abstraction of them, although people like to play around with Photoshop and all these things, right? So I think I think even within our family archives, right, in our kind of personal collections, we like likeness. Yeah, I understand that. There's similitude. Yeah. So I've been thinking more about that, not as necessarily capturing, quote, reality, but what is the kind of comfort in that, there's some comfort in the realist aesthetic, right? Yeah. And so then for me, it's like to not kind of abandon it, but to embrace it and to think a little more through it about in realism and form, and so. Yeah.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined by Professor Nicole Fleetwood, who's the author of the new book, Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness. What are you working on next, Nicole?
So I'm actually working on a couple of articles, and I'm using you right now in this piece that I'm writing about Rihanna, although I'm not, music is really not my area, although it's more around performance. Around visuality, yeah. But in terms of longer and kind of bigger projects, I am working on a book called Prison Art Public Culture, and it's both academic and personal in terms of thinking about my cousins who I have several cousins who are several male relatives who have been inmates at one time in prison or who are currently serving time. And I'm thinking about really visual production by inmates and how it troubles public culture, how prison by its very definition is the removal of individuals or populations from, quote, from the public, but how, visual production vernacular photography that takes place in prison and then gets sent to relatives and loved ones is really a way of inserting a presence of one of the most vulnerable populations in society back into a larger kind of public conversation, back into their family lives, And if you think about, there's a history of taking pictures of inmates. There's several collections by like Bruce Jackson and a woman, I think her name is Deborah Leister, and there's been documentaries done on Angola, and so you have so many images, documentary style images of artists and activists who have documented inmates. And much of what they have done has been talked about as these portraits of inmates as some type of rehearsal of death, as they're preparing for often the inevitability of dying incarcerated. And I'm really interested in amateur and vernacular images coming out of prison as a performance of life, actually, as a way of saying, you know, we're still alive, and you know, things are happening and we're aging. And so many of these images are actually really quite playful. A lot of the portraits that are taking place inside prisons, the inmates design these really elaborate backdrops, fantasies of their lives outside of prison, you know, and so you have this kind of projection of them into other worlds. And so I've been thinking about these images. I have a substantial collection of these images already that I'm looking at, and I'm collecting more. And I'm doing interviews with inmates and with some artists who have worked with inmates in prisons around that. And then I'm doing another project. I'm guest editing Coon Business, which is a new arts and culture magazine that was found by Greg Tate and Latasha Diggs. And so we're working on that right now, and that's also really, really fun. One of the most exciting parts of that for me is, you know, it's this really great space for art, criticism, and academic theory to come together. And you know, and as much as we know we enjoy that, there's not a whole lot of viable spaces
for us to do that. No, absolutely, absolutely.
Right. And so it's really quite exciting. And you know, Greg Tate came up with this theme for this special issue, which, you know, people can abandon as much as they want, but it's quantum negrosity and advanced ebonics, you know. It's just a mouthful.
Yes, out of the brilliant mind of Greg Tate, absolutely. You've been watching Left to Black. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Nicole Fleetwood, who's a professor of American Studies at Rutgers University, and she's also the author of the new book, Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, which was published by the University of Chicago Press this summer. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Again, Nicole.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
Take care. Welcome to Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, your host, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor William Banfield, composer, author, recording artist, musical director, scholar, professor of liberal arts, and the director of the Africana Studies Music and Society program at the Berklee College of Music, and the author of the new book, several books, but the new book, Representing Black Music Culture, Then, Now, and When Again. How are you doing today, Bill?
Oh, Mark, it's good to see you. Thank you for having me, and it's wonderful to be here.
I'm glad that you're on, and let me start by this wonderful quote that opens the foreword of your new book, Representing Black Music Culture, from Cornel West, where he says, William Banfield is one of the last grand Renaissance men in our time. Talk a little bit about that. You are an accomplished musician. You're a scholar, successful in both of those in your own right. You're also a composer. You're a bass musician. You have wide opinions about how the world works. You know, I think Cornel is right. I mean, there are a few of you out there who are still working every day that folks can be accessible to. So talk a little bit about this book. It's a musical memoir, if you will.
It's a memoir. And to your point about Cornel West, I think as a great scholar and cultural carrier that he is, he appreciates, as we all do and you do, the importance of that critical question of culture, how it's being carried and cared for. And those of us that are in the mix and teaching and writing music and being out there doing this, we have all of these issues that we have to deal with because the culture is so large, it's so rich, and it's now today moving so fast. So it's very, very important important to do that. I thought it was important, Mark, to have a memoir that actually, documented black musicians' lives. And those of us that have come up in the late 1960s or 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, it's kind of a generational bridge between the hip hop and the baby boom group. We have a lot to say because I feel as musicians, we were one of the groups that began to see music as it was as music. And that's not to poo-poo or critique too hardly on what's going on today. It's just that all the musicians that we hang out with kind of grew up in a musical environment where we're having to deal with a cultural shift, and it's okay. Each new generation is supposed to do that. But I was coming of age, coming to 50, so I wrote this 6 years, approaching the age of 50, to kind of chronicle what that was like and to deal with us coming of age and being 50.
You have this great line very early in the book when you talk about the role of the artist is to document the culture as one lives through it and lives within it. Talk a little bit about that because, when we talk about, culture in general, it's almost impossible to think culture today without thinking about the cultural apparatus, the buying and selling of culture. And in some ways, the idea that the artist has a responsibility to represent, right, this idea of representing black music culture, that gets lost in this desire to try to generate as much capital as possible, through our creativity.
I think so. I think you hit right on it. I think one of the things that Amiri Baraka asked in one of the publications of Blues People is, what do the people value, really? Yeah, right. And if you look at Coltrane, if you look at George Clinton, any great musician, they're asking the question about what do the people, value, and to try to be with that. Well, that's when musicians and artists are responsible and love carrying the culture, and they respond to the community. They also have to respond to the culture we live in. But what's happened now after the 1980s, I think, is the cultural shift that's happening is the commodification of culture. It's not like people weren't always selling the blues and selling blues records. Right.
Folks had to make a living, right?
Yeah, but the control factor is different, and the control factor is out of hand, actually. And so I think one of the things that we're concerned about is who really defines culture today. And when your artists, particularly in black culture, when your artists are out of touch with that, Mark, we have a problem because our griots have always told the stories. They have critiqued culture, they have asked the difficult questions, but they've also flowered a great art form. And that's been multifaceted for sure. And so we're asking, those of us that are a little older, and late 40s, 50s, asking, okay, what's happening? I love Kanye West. I love, Janelle Monáe. I love all of the new stuff, Rihanna, Beyonce, and all that. But I'm wondering, and we're all wondering, those of us that teach and write about it and play, wondering what's happening to our musical culture today.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by Professor Bill Banfield of the Berklee School of Music, where he's the director of the Africana Studies program. And we're talking about his new book, Representing Black Music, Then, Now, and When Again. You do suggest that, trying to piece together where these shifts occur, you talk about this notion of your parents saw themselves as race people, right? And that was a value that was passed on to you. Sure. And by that, this idea that black people are capable of greatness, strong character, ideas, achievements, and contribution to society. And you suggest that that's a value that is not as much in vogue anymore, for a younger generation, right?
Well, the one thing to the credit of what's going on now is that each generation creates a new value paradigm, a new system of dealing with that, and we all got love for that. But I think what we're concerned about is this notion, like you say, Mark, of value transfer. What do the people believe in? What does the culture say? What do the artists believe in? And the musicians and artists are those value carriers. You're absolutely right. I mean, the hard work, the kind of focus, the kind of first generation. My parents were born in the 1920s, so my mother would always say that she's a child of the Depression. Yeah. So I talked to them a lot about, and have been talking to them a lot about what that was like and what they struggled with. Well, that struggle turned to achievement in the 50s. And then they were the ones who were able to bring this whole thing forward. So they came full circle, full at us with, okay, now it's your turn to do something. And to do something meant to do something. Yeah. And to use all of that. So we're really concerned about this. Not that the culture's not doing anything now, but with push-button automation and everybody copying, and the origination of ideas is less is an issue that we're concerned with. Not that there's not great ideas out, but those kinds of value things I think we're looking at.
You know, one of the things that I think is kind of interesting, and I'll use Jay-Z and Kanye as kind of examples of this, that young folks, when they talk about Kanye and Jay-Z, they as much talk about their clothes and their gear, the things they have acquired in terms of material goods. There's little talk about the genius of their music.
That's right.
And I would argue for young folks, it's because in some ways they can't talk about the genius of their music. And you have this great essay, you know, late in the book where you talk about hop ain't hip without the music. What has happened that the music industry now is so fixated on these other things that it actually doesn't deal much with music?
Well, no,
Anyway.
that's a good point. I mean, look, no one's trying to bash hip hop culture. We came up in the '70s, so those guys actually were older than me. So the early ones, Kool Herc, and Grandmaster Flash, all those guys, Run DMC. But the problem is they were still very much steeped in the tradition of saying something with their work. The community there were concerns, things to be said. They said it by using the greatest music of the time, and they had a rhyme scheme. They had a vocal cadence that was much like the great music they were listening to. So they're part of that whole thing. But what has happened now that we've come into a situation where musicians are not primarily, artists are not primary. When I say artists, I mean, when we talk about artists, you and I know what we're talking. We're talking about craft and focus, and people who are concerned with what the music or the creativity is saying, not what the marketplace is dictating it should say. And that's a distinct difference. Because we have less musicians, we may have a John Legend, we may have an Alicia Keys, we may have occasionally a beat maker or a hip hop person who has some sensibilities to music and can understand that. But by and large, the mainstream hip hop and R&B focus is not on the music anymore. It's not run by musicians.
Right.
Musicians are not making the music anymore.
Right.
So what happens to the richest arts tradition in the world, one of them, black music tradition, when no longer musicians are saying what needs to happen in the music? So we need to call on Kanye and all these young artists to get with musicians and have musicians. Then they do. They have musicians in their bands, and you know, they're musicians around for sure. But that's not the main focus.
Not the foundational piece, right?
Yeah.
You know, that's a very interesting thing because, you know, one of the narratives that we know about hip hop, and at least the genius of that first generation of hip hop, is that enough of these cats had an ear for music that even when they no longer could learn music and, for instance, the New York City school system, they could find a way to articulate music in other means.
That's right.
You were fortunate to be born and raised in Detroit. And this fabulous story, the music capital, Motown. You know, myself and our bud Anthony Kelly, you know, we're co-teaching the class on Motown in the spring, so we know about the genius of the place. But even within Detroit, you had a place like Cass Tech.
That's right.
And when you look at the names of the folks who graduated from Cass Technical, you got the violinist Regina Carter, who you went to school with, the jazz pianist Jerry Allen, Greg Fillinganes, who of course for a long time was Michael Jackson's musical director, Paul Reiser, who, you know, is one of the most exceptional string arrangers, right, in the history of black music, right? The only contemporary artist who ever know anything about Paul Reiser, ironically, is R. Kelly and Michelle and Dave Gilcello, right? And then you also got folks like Ron Carter, who of course was a young man when he gets started with the Miles Davis Quintet, Curtis Fuller. What was it about growing up in Detroit at that point in time? You know, first of all, it has to be a kind of vision, and let's put that vision off on Coleman Young now, you know, for the moment, to understand that it was still important to make arts a critical aspect of learning for young folks, even as folks were dealing with all these economic dynamics at that point in time.
Absolutely. I mean, if you trace in the great migrations, black folks settling and from Mississippi and moving to Chicago, and those folks that moved to New York, and those folks that certainly moved to Detroit, you get a different configuration of people from those southern states. Why Detroit happened the way it did with its automotive boom, it allowed the black middle class to happen in the beginning of the century when Ford was able to pay these people moving from 50 cents a day or a week to $5 a week. That does a lot. So black folks were able to move into a different sense of themselves, and so they called their cultural carriers, the best of them. So Ellington is coming to Detroit. All the great jazzers, and they were able to actually build the kinds of you know, nightclubs and neighborhoods that could support great music, and that extended to music not only just in the clubs, but extended to plays and extended to to symphony
the
music,
churches,
and
right?
art music. Churches were huge, so you could build big churches that could support a young gospel choir with somebody, and then singing, and also at the same time a string quartet or have a educational forum or whatever. So all of these things happen in the black church, and given the economics of the city with the economics from the auto boom and what have you, so it allowed a black culture to exist and educate and to have these kinds of wider discussions about what music culture was. And so I don't know, Motown and the story of Berry Gordy is wonderful. And so you got great gospel, jazz, R&B, all percolating in the city.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Bill Banfield, author of the new book, Representing Black Music Culture, Then, Now, and When Again. You leave Detroit and you settle down in Boston, and one of the people that you meet when you're there is a man that at least here, those of us in the Triangle region are very familiar with, but you meet T.J. Anderson.
Yes.
And it's T.J. Anderson that talks with you about the idea of thinking of yourself as a composer. Yeah. And of course, you've been able to have a very rich career, aside from your kind of R&B, pop, jazz feat, right? You also have this feat also, in the world of classical music, in the world of chamber music as a composer. What has it been like being, part of that handful of really noted, nationally known, black composers?
Well, my mother and father messed me up, actually. In Detroit, we also had the Detroit Symphony, and I loved Jimi Hendrix. So I grew up, my parents took me to, if I could see Jimi Hendrix on TV, I wanted to be like that, then the Motown and the gospel. Then they took us to the symphony. Right. So I just thought the symphonic world was a place where Jimi Hendrix ought to be playing guitar. Right. She messed me up like that, my mom and dad. So I always wanted to be a great composer like Brahms running around in Vienna or Stravinsky. And then I wanted to be like Duke Ellington too, and I wanted to be like and I found out that we had this great history of black composers, those folks who don't write primarily jazz, or they can, but the majority of the black composers that we hang out, like a T.J. Anderson, are people who are steeped in the classical tradition, but who bring the black voice to that. And so you have this great tradition that's not visible. So by the time all of us were coming to Boston in the late 70s, early 80s, T.J. Anderson was at Tufts University. I was at Newman Conservatory with Don Byron, Regina Carter, wow. Carla Cook, wow. Najee. All of us were there at the same time. Rachel Nichols, Rachel Z. So we were there, but the TJ was over at Tufts University, Mark. And so they had a 2020 exchange program, and I heard there was this black composer teaching. I was about 18 or 19. And he said, young man, you have a lot to say, but you need to learn how to say it. And he taught me how to focus and introduced me to this idea. I loved classical music, but how to think about that as a composer. And that's where it started. He is my mentor, my main mentor to this day. It's not a thing that I do in life artistically or anything that I don't consult or call him. And so that association started in 1980. My goodness, 30 or so years. And he's something else, right down there with you all.
Yes. You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Bill Banfield talking about the future of black music culture. All of us have our iPods, right? And I'm always proud to talk about, I got my little 160 gig iPod, and I got my 20,000. And it's, it's a wonderful experience because I literally have my musical archive with me. And at least when I'm in the classroom, it allows me to be able to pull things in ways that just would have been very difficult even 10 years ago. We'd be coming to our classes with cassette tapes and CDs and albums if there was a record player, and trying to manage all this kind of stuff. And now the technology makes it seamless. Yeah. But even as young folks now have access to all of this music, it seems that their breadth of taste is getting smaller. I mean, it's the irony, right? They literally have access to thousands of songs now, but yet their sense of what music is, is getting smaller and smaller. I'll use an example. Fortunately, North Carolina has become this really interesting space, especially Durham, but, our good friend Shona Tucker, the cellist, came to my class a few weeks ago. And she played Come Sunday, and she sang some of her original music. And there's students in my class who are saying, well, that's not black music.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's part because they don't recognize it. You know, they only recognize certain things as black music. As someone who's in the classroom, who is a musician, who is a composer, who is a historian of black music, you know, what are the challenges you face, and what are some of the things that you do in order to get young folks to better listen, you know, to the music that's out there?
Oh, no, you hit it right on the button. I think one of the problems that we face, that we're challenged with, is a cultural apparatus, as you said, and a mechanism that values a patchwork identity as the way you should be. So everybody's able to push something really quick and make their own identity. And when you're branding yourself over and over again, you don't know yourself, do you? You only know the process of constructing something else that may not really be you. Right. So when people listen to music, like one of the things is to make young musicians listen to the blues.
Right.
They don't listen to blues.
Right.
Like they'll be all up into Kirk Franklin and Hammond and everybody else and never have listened to the spirituals.
Right.
So one of the, and these are for musicians now. So that's one level of the difficulty, let alone what the general kid or young person is faced with. They have no sense of what their lineage and legacy is historically. Well, in the 60s, people were always making a shout back to James Brown back and further. So you always had this sense of how rich the tradition is. It's not just that the young people don't appreciate it. Our challenge is fighting a larger mega culture that defines what modernity or what's being hip or cool or hot is, and they have to deal with that. And it's so seductive and beautiful and sexy and cool. How could you not want to be on MTV or be on American Idol? Because they tell you that's the thing to do, and it's going to give you $1 million. So you're going to forget about focus and tradition and skill sets
and craft, right?
And craft is the large thing, Mark, that really defines the musician from someone who's just playing at it. A player and someone who's just playing at it. So our challenge with musicians is getting them to also slow down and look. And the way we deal is we deal with everything from West African music tradition, the griot traditions of singing, song, making your own instrument, being embedded in songs that teach the history. And then those people were transported in the African diaspora from Brazil to Jamaica to Detroit, by the way, and Chicago. And those traditions were very much in place. So if you teach young people to see that, they're not going to want no crap. If you really show them where the meat is. Now, it's their job, like it was our job, to take that tradition and create a new vision. Right. We're not saying they shouldn't be doing or that they're not doing a great job. If you look at great, you know, Janelle Monáe, I love John, you know, Legend, all these folks that get it. They're constructing a new way, but I think the way out of it for me as a musician teaching has really been to really get the musicians to see this long legacy all the way to Duke Ellington, all the way up to Run DMC, all the way beyond, and then they usually, you know, people say that the creative gene has not gone out of the gene pool. It's just the stuff that's out here that constricts that creativity, that doesn't allow young people to be the best that they can be.
We're here with Professor Bill Banfield of the Berklee School of Music, author of the new book representing black music culture, Then, Now, and When Again. You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. You know, one last thing, Bill, one of the things I love about the book is the kind of Forrest Gump quality to your life. and by that, I mean you turn every page and there's a picture with you with someone extraordinary. You know, the late Dr. Billy Taylor, you know, our friend Guthrie Ramsey. I mean, just this whole Patrice Rushen, a great picture of you, Patrice Rushen, and Bobby McFerrin. It's like, what has it been like for you, you know, as someone who came into this already excited about the music, to be able to have this incredible contact with all of these musical geniuses?
Well, I think that the whole notion of what the other aspect of the book is to highlight that community. Yeah. The reason why I show those pictures is not to draw attention to me. It really, really is to draw attention to the community of musicianships that we have, the community of artistry that musicians and artists and poets have. I mean, it's everybody in there from Yusef Kumunyaka to, you know, across the board.
Cornel West, yeah. Skip Gates, yeah.
Yeah, I want to show that we all are making, and you too. There's a great picture of you,
me
myself,
and Anthony Kelly. Yes.
Just feeling that. What's that great thing that you go to down there?
Oh, BU. Shout out to the BU Cafe.
Man, I love that. So when we came together, we hung there. That's what artists do, man. We get together and talk about all these things that we value. I wanted that to be the story. That nobody's trying to be famous. We're trying to be famous in terms of whatever famous means in terms of famous among each other, at least be famously loving to each other, and to do that. So that's what I wanted to show in that book, and the variety of artistry and conversations that happen. Every great movement we know with great music, Mark, it's always been multifaceted, and I wanted that to be the message that comes through too, that we all are growing in this culture together, and that's why it's 40 years of tracking that growth. Right. And we got another, you and I got another 40 or 50 more to go, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right?
You've been watching Left to Black, and we've been joined by Professor William C. Banfield, who is a professor of Africana Studies at Berklee School of Music. He is the author of numerous books, but most importantly, the very new Representing Black Music Culture, Then, Now, and When Again. Thanks for joining us today, Bill.
Thank you, Mark. It's been great to be here with you.
Take care.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.